Hey guys, so this is the second recording. This is a PowerPoint about art and reality. And with this PowerPoint, hopefully I'm gonna get to make the point. You'll get the point that art is not really what we perceive in so many ways. The best way to appreciate art, the best way to approach art, the best way to start understanding art is to look at the reality of what you're looking at, and then from that point, then start building, what you're seeing. So most of you take this class sometimes to kind of get a idea on how to look at art and how to get it right, how to see really what the artist is trying to do, what the artist is trying to say. So here's the very first part of it. Um, Hopefully, with the previous PowerPoint, I was able to kind of reconstruct what an artist is, and in this one, we're going to talk about the actual thing that you're seeing in artwork. So let's get started. So the reality of art. Um, Here in the image, I chose to pick one of my favorite artists out there, one that I think I enjoy quite a bit when I look at her artwork. Her name is um, Louise Bourgeois. And Louise Bourgeois is this really old lady. Obviously, she was not always old, but most of her old, most contemporary, well-recognized work, I should say, it's when she was in her elder years, and she's just this wonderful, wonderful lady. One of the coolest things about her artwork, in some ways, is that um, the art it comes from her own personal experiences and her relationship with family members, and how she is psychologically kind of trapped in her own past in some ways. Uh, and a lot of it had to do with sexuality. So you'll see a lot of phalluses and this other sexual related content made by this really old lady, and I've always found that really, really intriguing and fascinating, and just kind of fun and funny, but really cool nevertheless. So this giant spider is called Mammon, and Mammon it is a physical representation of how she feels about her mom. So it is kind of a metaphor for her mom, and it's a protector of sorts. So let's see that sculpture right there. Okay, so we're going to be looking at three major groups in art. If we were in the classroom, I would have asked you guys, I would have divided you guys into the three different groups, and I would have asked you to look up what it is representational art, what is abstract art, and what is non-representational art on your own, and create your own kind of concept in simple words of what those three things are. For this digital version of the class, I'm just going to go ahead and move forward. I'm still going to get the same responses, but without the experience, obviously. So before we go into each one of these three different things, let's talk about the reality of art, the context of this PowerPoint. I'm going to show you this specific painting. So this painting is almost as large as what you see probably in your screen. It's not very large. And it's a painting by Margaret. So Margaret um, is a surreal artist. And I like Margaret because a lot of surrealism is about the reality of things, but how we kind of create this non-reality around us to make us more comfortable. In our contemporary times, we tend to do that a lot. But nevertheless, so let's look at this specific painting. So this specific painting right here in French is this says "Ce n'est pas un pipe," which basically translates "this is not a pipe," right? But this is not a pipe, right? So why is this not a pipe? Look at it and try to think in the back of your mind, why in the world would Margaret say that this is not a pipe? What is the reality of it that it's not a pipe? Well, that statement's 100% true. This is not a pipe. Why is this not a pipe? Well, very simple. That object right there was a painting, right? Actually, what you're looking at, it is a light representation through a screen of an object that was a painting that depicted a pipe. The original painting was just paint on a surface. At any point whatsoever, any of those materials, either the canvas or the wood or the paint or the brushes or any of that was a pipe. The only thing that is a pipe is the object that you actually could smoke. That is pipe. Everything else is not. This is just a visual representation of the pipe using a specific set of materials. Okay? So that is the reality of this artwork. That this artwork is not a pipe, this artwork is paint on canvas. So it's very important to understand that. That's why I've always said at the beginning of this thing is that in order for you to start to understand artwork, you have to first understand that what you see is a reality there, and from that reality, you can move forward. If you look at this and say this is a pipe, you're already wrong. Okay, let's move forward a little bit. So let's start with representational art, objects that artworks that represent things that we recognize. So a representational piece of artwork is art that depicts the appearance of things. The artwork is representing an object that can be recognized from the natural or the everyday world, right? So for example, that painting of a pipe, it would be a representational artwork. Why? Because we can recognize what that is, right? That we can recognize a pipe from there. So let's say a painting of flowers. Well, that's representational art because we can possibly recognize flowers. Now, these objects that the representational art depicts are called subjects. So once again, so if we're looking at the painting with flowers, then our subject matter, our subjects are flowers. Right? Or the subject for that other painting that we saw by Margaret is a pipe, right? So that's the subject. Now, the only time there's a caveat to this is if you see the human being, so if you have a human form depicted as a subject, we don't longer call it a subject, we call it a figure. Or the artwork itself, we call it figurative art, right? So anytime you see the representation of the human form, right, in a painting, that is not a person, it is a figure, right? Or we call that figurative art, right? So let me ask you a question, right? Is there a person here in this painting? Do you see a person? If you said that there was a person, you're incorrect because I would want you to touch the screen and tell me that is a person. Unfortunately, that is not a person. That is a depiction of one. This is what we call a figure. Okay, so this is a figure, and that is a figure, and this is figurative art. Okay, now this is a very beautiful painting and a very interesting painting, Edouard Manet. Okay, this is Manet, not Monet. And one of the coolest and interesting things about this painting is that our perspective, we are basically this gentleman right there from the mirror, right? So we are that person, and we're looking at this individual from this perspective. And there's all the kinds of social matter happening in this painting, but nevertheless, it's a very, very Manet's life and for the art world. So let's move on to a little bit more about representational art. So we have kind of different levels of representational art. The most clear way of seeing representational art, not clear way, but most um, kind of photographically representations of the real world into art is called trompe-l'oeil, right? So trompe-l'oeil is a French word or words that means fool's eye. This kind of artworks are artworks, like I said, are almost photographical, meaning they're almost a translation, literally, from reality to a painting, right? So, for example, in this case, we have this artwork right here by William Harnett. We have the newspapers, and we have the pipe, and we have all these other objects, and they look very much like the real world. This is what we would call a trompe-l'oeil. During uh, basically this time period and before this, there were some painters that wanted to achieve this kind of basically duplication of nature to the point that even the flies would um, confuse themselves into going into fruit that looked to be so realistic that they wanted to land on it. That's kind of what Trompe L'oeil wants to achieve. If we go even further into this kind of Trompe L'oeil concept, then we get into hyperrealism. Hyperrealism is this element where the boundary between reality and artwork kind of gets blurred, right? So, for example, we have this beautiful old lady, which is called City Woman by Ron Newick. And if you were to look at this artwork, it's very uncanny. All right, uncanny. There you go. Artwork when you don't know whether what you're looking at is truly a real individual, right, or if it's a figure, right? This representation of the human. So it's very interesting with trompe l'oeil versus hyperrealism. With hyperrealism, most of the times it's going to be a three-dimensional object because you're able to represent reality in such a way that you no longer know whether what you're seeing is real or not. So kind of that's the difference between hyperrealism and trompe l'oeil. Trompe l'oeil tends to be more two-dimensional, hyperrealism to the three-dimensional, but obviously there are exceptions to what I just said. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, one of the things to understand is that as we move forward, neither one of those things are complete solid blocks of artwork. They are very fluid. So they tend to expand into one another in, for example, abstract. So abstraction, it's a very encompassing artwork. Normally we think of abstract art as kind of this amalgamation of shapes and forms and whatever it is. And we cannot recognize what it is. And that is really truly not quite right. So abstraction, the word abstract just literally means to take away, right? To take from, to extract the essence of an object or idea. So abstract artworks range from works that depict natural objects in simplified, distorted, or exaggerated ways, still representational, to works that have no reference at all to the natural world. They're almost completely abstractual, almost to non-representational art. We'll talk about in a minute. So abstraction has this huge window in which abstract work exists, right? In the most simplistic part of abstraction, right? In the world of representation, meaning things represent, right? Before I go into that, let me ask you this. For example, if we were to take a picture right now, right, of where you're at, and then you take that and you put it in Instagram and you put a filter, a black and white filter, would that image be an abstract artwork? Think about it. Is the reality of our world around us colored or black and white? It's colored. We experience our world through color. So the moment we take color away from that photograph, right, we're abstracting the color. That photograph on itself will be considered abstract. Now, that is in the very, 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 very edge of abstraction within representational artwork, right? Most people would not consider that abstract, and I probably wouldn't call it abstract myself. But I do want to point out that that's still somehow abstracted from reality. So in some ways, it is an abstract display. Here's another concept of representation, and it kind of goes to what I'm talking about. So even though you can recognize the form here, the subject, right, all three of those, for example, there are different kinds of abstraction, right? So this is not the way we normally recognize a cow, right? And neither is this way. This one's too rigid and this one's too square. And this is the other one, right? This is the one that goes to the other end of abstraction. And normally this is what we would call abstraction. Now, this last object right here, we still would consider it abstract. But not abstract because we cannot recognize it or because it's all mungled up or whatever it is. but rather because in here we still have a cow of some sorts, right? We took away from the original, right, as much as possible until we got to this blocks by themselves. But nevertheless, the essence of a cow is still somewhere in there. So that is still an abstract. This is all abstract in different level. This is as far as possible, I think, in some way, get to an abstract piece of art. So once again, here's another example of an abstract. Now you're probably going to say, well, Mr. B, that's not an abstract, right? Well, uh, the world is not blue, and this figure right here is very cumbersome, and it's not really a true representation of reality. This has been disfigured. This has been uh, abstracted, changed. So it's not. It's still representational, right? We can still recognize objects from reality, right? So representational piece of artwork is still there, but it's definitely abstracted, right? Not definitely, but slightly abstracted, I should say. And that's Pablo Picasso, the old guitarist from his blue period. And here we have the other side of the spectrum, right? So here is Pollock. And here, this is an abstraction as well. Pollock still was conceptually, or in his mind's eye, thought about the subject matter. So whether it was a form, or whether it was a shape, or whether there were forms and shapes, I apologize, but more like a figure, a person, or a movement, or something tied to reality, but abstracted in such a way that you cannot really recognize it right off the bat, or you very hard to recognize here any of that, right? Especially him as an abstract expressionist. Now, one of the coolest things is that when you go and see a bunch of his artworks, you'll see that you'll start seeing some patterns, and the way he kind of approaches certain things. So, but nevertheless, so there's still part of representational elements in there, or reality in there, but it has been abstract. And this is where it makes sense to the other end of the spectrum, right? So this is non-representational art. What is non-representational art? Non-representational art is when there is no subject, right? There's no object or subject in there. So it's also known as non-objective. Not subject, but object, my apologies. So in this case, we have art without reference to anything outside of itself. What do I mean by that? Well, a non-representational art will not be attached to flowers or horses or a room or anything. It is only going to be referential to color or material or shapes or forms, things that are only art and art only, right? So when you abstract, right, you still have to have some kind of sense of reality. Whether you're abstracting lightly or whether completely abstracting to the level of Jackson Pollock. When you're no longer looking at reality anymore, right, then you get into this very, very end of things, which is non-representation. Okay. Here's a great example of non-representational art. So non-representational art in this case is done through pattern, where you're using calligraphy, words, writing to create a decoration, create a facade, and visual aesthetics into this building. One of the things I want you guys to pay attention in the difference between Western art and in this case Middle Eastern art is that Middle Eastern culture, especially Muslim culture, does not allow theologically to have the human form represented within buildings, especially if it's a religious building. And most people's dwellings are kind of approached in that manner. But nevertheless, the reason why I'm mentioning that is because since you're not able to represent the person figure through figure, then you represent it through their words, right? So in many, 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 many cases, what you see is the representation of God or Allah and all this other, the Quran, through the words rather than through pictures, right? So in the Christian world, we have pictures of Jesus, and we have pictures of all this elements within our churches, but for Muslims, they don't. So in order to have the representation of Allah and Quran, whatever, these are the writings that happen, or the decorations are writings, more like it. Okay. However, these are not the words, are not depictions from reality, right? They don't exist natural in the world, so this is non-representational. Here's another non-representational piece, right? If you're looking for the sunset, if you're looking for the city, if you're looking for whatever it is, you're already in the wrong side of things. This is completely non-representational, meaning this is only about art. This is only about the color red. This is only about the color yellow, black, white, and blue. It's all about squares and rectangles and lines and how they interact with one another, and that's it, right? Now, in this case with Mondrian, we have the case that Mondrian was one of those artists who, through the era of modernism, kind of went through all the phases. Okay, so he was originally a representational artist, kind of not trompe l'oeil by any chance, but very realistic, very naturalistic, I should say. Right, so you go from very naturalistic looking artworks into a much more abstracted, where he took the naturalism slowly took away from it until he finally came down to very simple elements to depict those natural elements. And at one point he thought, well, why am I doing that when I'm just using paint, right? And then he moved forward, and now he, towards the end of his career, that's basically what he was doing, right? Non-representational art, lines, colors, textures, and so forth. Here's one example. Here's another one that is a non-representational piece of artwork by a fairly well-known modern artist. And a lot of people, this is the kind of artwork that, in general, you guys, well, not you guys, just people in general don't understand and toss out as bad art or not good art or I don't get it kind of art. And so this is, Mark Rothko. And this kind of artworks, if you're looking for the sunset, there's no sunset. If you're looking for the house, there's no house. If you're looking for the gravel, there's no gravel. There's nothing that is representation whatsoever. This is just color, period, nothing else. And the relationship between one color to the next and how you emotionally approach it or interact with it. That's it, nothing else. Right? Now, if you feel that there's sunset colors in here and there's a warmth that you feel emotionally because it reminds you of a sunset, perfectly fine. But the reality is that there is absolutely nothing representational in this artwork to connect it to nature. Period. This is just art and it's paint on a canvas. So, how to approach abstract and non-representational art. So non-objective art, which is the hardest one really for you guys, it's a difficult one. I mean, we have been brought up in a culture in where we say good art tends to look a specific way, and you can recognize it. You can, it's got lots of color. It's got I don't know, things from nature and so forth. It's just kind of this novelist social construct of what art should be. But anyways, how do we start understanding this concept of contemporary art, right? So what I really want you to do is I am going to do a little exercise. I'm going to put some music. I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things. So hopefully you're really going to take the time and do the exercise. It's going to be better if you do. Okay. So let me go ahead and show back the screen. Right. And I'm going to be playing. So what I want you to do the next probably a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, I want you to go ahead and grab one of your index cards, right? So I want you to go grab cards, right? And I want you to hopefully you got colors, right? And what I want you to do this card with the colors is to draw what you hear. Okay, just let yourself be drawn or driven by the music. It doesn't have to be quote unquote pretty. It doesn't have to be representational. It doesn't have to be anything specific. I just want you to let yourself go and just draw what you hear. Okay, so let's see. Oops. All right, so I'm gonna start from. So listen and draw what you hear. So, one of the things I'm going to say is I really don't think that what you drew is going to look anything like anybody else drew, right? So even if we were to able to share everybody's, little pictures, I don't think that either one of them are going to look the same. They might have some elements that are similar, uh, but none of them are going to be identical. And that's really important to understand because there's a physicality to that is very important to understand as we understand the reality of art. So as we continue moving forward, on. This is Antonio Vivaldi, and that's Winter. This is what I'm talking about. So the, the contemporary concept, the modern concept, came from looking at music, right? So let's think about it this way. When you look at this right here, would you consider that Vivaldi's piece is a classical piece of music? Would you consider it to be classical? Hopefully you do, because most of us consider it to be classical, right? Now, if we look at this other painting right here, would you consider this painting as well as a classical painting, right? And most of us would recognize this as classical piece of painting. So, and they're both from, roughly similar time periods in history, okay? Um, but let's look at what the relationship is between those two. It's Michelangelo, and this is one of the paintings from that we have here in Dallas Fort Worth, actually in Fort Worth, at the King Art Museum. So, if we were to break down this piece of music, right? If we were to break down to all its basic elements, right, we would have notes, right? And we would have all these little different elements. Now, can we reorganize these elements to create a different kind of song or music? Yes, we definitely can, right? That's basically what we do with music. So if this is a classical piece of artwork and we break it down into the most basic elements, and then from these elements we can recreate basically any kind of music, then why can't we do the same thing with a different kind of art, right? In this case, like I said, visual arts, a painting, okay? So when you break down a painting into its most basic of elements, right, what would they be? Think about it. What would those elements be? Take a minute, write a couple of things. If you were to break down this painting into its most basic of elements, what would it be? Think about the music part, right? We broke down the music into music notes, and from the music notes we can create something new. You know? So some of you might have thought, okay, well, we have figures here, right? We have these people. No, not quite. You would have to break it down even further, right? What are the elements that make this painting? And the key word in there, key word of what I'm saying is the word painting, right? What is a painting? And if we have to go back to Margaret, right, to this is not a pipe, in order to understand what I'm saying. So if we're to break down this painting is most basic of elements, the most basic things that we have is going to be the canvas, is going to be the paint, right? And then you could say the yellow color paint and the blue color paint and all the different color paints, and that'd be fine, right? Because right, there'd be like different kinds of notes in some ways, right? And then you would also have possibly the brush to create all these things, right? Now, when you take those basic elements, we can create any kind of painting, period. There is absolutely no specific guidelines in music like there's none art, right? It's just that we have created this kind of, once again, social construct of knowing what art is by saying, oh, it has to have these elements, right? But it's not true. We can have something, right? A simple reconstruction of the musical notes to make a birthday song, right? Happy birthday to, right? Very simple. Well, if we do the same thing with paint and canvas, right? A very simple, methodic, elemental type organization of canvas and paint, then there we go. You have something like this. It's still paint, still canvas, just like the other painting, right? But here's Frank Stella. And if we go to the opposite side of the spectrum, right? We have jazz. Jazz is completely improvised. Jazz is not specific to many quote unquote rules of music, right? There is, certain things that makes a good jazz and bad jazz, but nevertheless, jazz tends to be much more chaotic, Well, if you can do that with music, why can't you do that with paint? Right? So that is the principles behind the contemporary and the modern idea behind art. That art is not constrained by this depiction of reality or the natural of the natural world. I mean, rather it's constructed or bound by the material, by its basic elements, just like music is for the notes and so forth and so on. Art is bound by the materials, whether it's paint, whether it's canvas, whether it's iron, water, whatever it is they use the material to create. Okay? But that is the modern concept of someone. When you're looking at artwork, then you have to understand that there's two ways to experience it. Actually, no, just one right way to experience it. And we have to differentiate it from a different, right? So most of us, when we're first experiencing art, we just look at art. We don't see art. So we have to understand the difference between looking and seeing. So what is looking? What's versus seeing? So looking, as I just mentioned, it's just kind of the habit or mechanical action that allows us to recognize the world around us. It's just basically our sense, right? It allows us to understand where we fit in the world around us. It doesn't require much stuff. It requires us to use our eyes, period, nothing else. Seeing, seeing is slightly different. Seeing requires you to stop. Okay, so it's a step further than the functional action of looking, because seeing requires considered effort and focus. So it requires you to stop and actually pay attention to what you're looking at and possibly ask questions and uh, experience it or go further into it. Right? Here's one of my favorite quotes, and it's good because it's kind of timeless, but in some way it's extremely relevant to our contemporary times, even though it's over 100 years old. So this quote is by a very well-known artist, and I'll tell you who it is. And it says, "To see is itself a creative operation, requiring effort. Everything that we see in our daily life is more or less distorted by acquired habits. And this is perhaps more evident in an era like ours when cinema, posters, and magazines present to us every day with a flood of ready-made images, which are to the eye, prejudice is to the mind. The effort needed to see things without distortion takes something very much like courage." And this is Henry Matisse who said this. And it's really interesting to see this quote, like I said, just because of contemporary times, because it says that to see itself is a creative operation. What is creativity? It requires kind of, right, doing something new that has value and so forth and so on. So in other words, it requires you to open your mind, right? And it requires effort. It requires you to do something. The other thing it talks about here is, you know, that we become um, lazy, basically. We become like little birds in some ways, right? Little birds, meaning baby birds just open their mouth, right? And all the food that the parents bring goes in. Doesn't matter what it is. You don't choose whether it's grasshoppers or worms or whatever. And everything's already chewed up and formatted for you and just goes down the hatchet without understanding anything that you're getting, right? You don't stop and look at the image. You don't stop and and really think what you're looking at, but rather just consume it, right? So, and by that, that's the part that says that it is basically like prejudice to the mind, right? When you're prejudiced, you create this, blanket idea of everything, and then you just judge everything by the same idea, and that's prejudice. You do not allow yourself to understand the individual or understand the problem, but rather judge it all the same. That's prejudice. So images in this case is what we're talking about, right? So this flood of ready-made images, which are to the eye, are prejudice to the mind, right? So you just want to see things right? We call good art things that are X, Y, Z, right? We have things that are representation of the world, that are colorful, that are pretty, and so forth and so on. And that's what it is, right? So we glance it, we see it, we like it, we move on, right? But in order to see, that needs to be questioned. You have to stop. You have to really question what you're consuming. That requires courage. It requires you to take a step further. What is this? What is this object? Right? Maybe some of you automatically saw what this object is. But regardless, and I love when I see it on the screen, the computer screen, on the projections in the classroom, it doesn't have the same um, visual tactile uh, beauty that this has on the screen. But most of you, when you first saw it, really didn't see the object that it is. There's a sensuality to this object, right? There's a sense of humanity to it. The skin of this object tends to look almost human. There's this sense of flaws and things. Nevertheless, there's a connectivity. It almost looks like a tongue, or things embracing. It looks like skin, or it looks like all the elements like that. And I bet you that you've never seen a bell pepper like this. This is what it is, the bell pepper, right? But artists do this kind of things. Artists are looking for the beauty of things, right? And it's our job to be able to recognize those things art, right? So we as artists spend time focusing on the artworks, on the subject of seeing it, understanding it, and then we create artworks, right? That take a snapshot of what we find beautiful, right, on those things, and then from that, then we create an artwork, and hopefully, you take the time to look at that and then see what we're trying to convey to the art, right? That is one of the important things about art. So you cannot just glance through it and say, "Oh, this looks like whatever it is," and then move forward. In order for you able to experience the bell pepper connection that it can have to you, a vegetable, how it can be connected to you as a human, you have to stop and look at it, right? As I mentioned before, this object right here, right? It's there's a sensuality to it that's very much attached to our own humanity. And like I mentioned before, some of you might have seen a tongue, or you might have seen a fetus, or you might have seen a butt, or all kinds of different things that are very much the connectivity between one and the other. And I bet you that none of you past would have had the time to just stop before you make it into fajitas and just look at the object and go, "Oh, this is such a beautiful thing." You don't spend the time to do that when you're in the middle of your day. But when you're looking at artwork, artist is giving you that option to stop and see or something as simple as a bell pepper. Edward Weston. So basically what I've been talking about is being a viewer that is an active participant on the art world, on the creative process. You know, um, the artwork is not complete until it's received, right? So until it's understood in some ways, because uh, art is basically art is basically a conversation, right? There's something that is here that's being shown, and then you have the receptor here, your, and there's a relationship between one or the other. So it cannot just completely exist on itself. It needs to have the other half. So how can you be an active participant in that process? So the very first thing to understand is that in order to really get a piece of artwork, you have to see that the time and effort that it takes to make is equals to the time and effort to understand the artwork. Right? Now, most of you are thinking, oh yeah, that makes sense. But what about the artworks that, it's just a canvas and you have a dot in the center, or it's just this thing and just like one line and that's it, it's done, right? It only took 30 seconds to make, so why would I have to take time to look at it if it's just that? Well, it goes back to what we talked about in the previous PowerPoint, right? There is a body of work. There is a growth that exists from one series of artworks to the next one to the next one. So an artist has grown. Their understanding of art has grown into the point that they create, that one artwork with a dot in the center. So even though physically that artwork took maybe 30 seconds, maybe, right? The art itself, the concept of this thing has taken what, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? That's the time that you have to allow yourself to understand. Now, obviously, you cannot take 30 years in a museum and look at it for 30 years. And I don't look at anything for a long period of time. But what I'm saying is that it requires time to understand it. And if you truly, truly, truly understand a piece of artwork, you cannot just, look at it and say, oh, that's what it is. You have to read about it. You have to read about the artist, and you have to read about where this concept came from in order to understand, really, truly understand the artwork, right? So those are the things that this is what is saying. The amount of time, right, that it took to make the artwork is equal to the time and effort it is to understand both of those things. You cannot just glance through an artwork, look at it, and say, oh, good artwork and bad artwork, and move on. Right? If you like it, you don't like it visually, that's fine, but that doesn't mean you understand it. You're not an active part of that creative process. Now, it's extremely also important to understand and be real. Remember that we're talking about reality today. That is not easy. This grounding of understanding reality, especially with art, it is not easy, right? For many reasons. Because since the moment we're born, right, we are given a set of rules that allows us to maneuver around the world, right? So, for example, somebody puts, I don't know, this in front of my face and go, earphones. And then the next thing is like a phone, right? And so forth and so on. And that helps us understand the world. But nevertheless, it is constructed to be that equals that, right? But with artwork, we have to deconstruct it somehow. We have to, not somehow, but we have to deconstruct it. And I'll explain that in a minute. The other thing about it is that forms evoke different responses from different people. That's another thing that we have to be understanding of, right? So it's not only easy to say that, that this thing in reality is earphones, but when it's art, it's no longer earphones, right? Or that's the phone, but when it's in a museum, in a gallery, it's no longer a phone, because that's what we've been taught just first started, growing up, right? The other thing is going to be the emotions they're evoked, right? For example, a rose or a flower, right? A flower for some of you may connected to emotions of motherhood, some of them to grandparents, some of them to death. I mean, we all respond to different things differently. So the reason why it's not easy when experiencing artwork is because you have to detach yourself from that emotion. Not only, once again, this is not earphones, but I cannot be attached to my emotional attachment to what earphones means to me in order to understand the artwork. So in a museum, this is no longer earphones, and maybe my attachment to music is no longer valid when it's artwork. And that is not how to deconstruct yourself away from it. And that's the last one, right? It requires a complete disconnect from form. That is the key in many ways to experiencing artwork. Not only do we have to make concept and a reality to say, oh, this is a pipe, it's actually canvas and paint, right, all put together to look like a pipe. But then all of a sudden, that same thing is no longer what we see. It's no longer a pipe, really. And it's not really the emotion that I get up a pipe that reminds me of an uncle that smoked pipe, right? It's something completely different. because a pipe and the words beneath it is just a representation of an idea that's telling me, hey, reality is not reality, it's a reality that we all know. You know, that's really what the artwork is about. One word, loosely. Here's another great example of that, right? So what do you see? What do you experience in this case? Right? What are you staring at? This is representational, non-representational, abstract. What is it? Well, in this case, it's Georgia O'Keeffe's and it's Jack in the pulpit. It's a flower. Okay. And one of the things I like this specific thing is that our experience is different, but the artist itself um, already does a lot of the work for you in order to find beauty in things. As I mentioned before with bell pepper, you just have to allow yourself to experience it. But in order to experience it, it's better to disconnect yourself, from that reality. Nevertheless, Georgia O'Keeffe says this about seeing versus looking in a very beautiful way about flowers. And it says that everyone has many associations with flowers. Right? Remember we were talking about associations a second ago? Yeah. The idea of flowers, still, in a way, nobody sees a flower. Really. It is so small. We haven't had the time, and to see takes time. Like to have a friend takes time. If I could paint the flower exactly as I see it, no one would see what I see because I would paint it small. Like the flower is small. So I say to myself, I paint what I see, what the flower is to me, but I'll paint it big, and they will be surprised into taking the time to look at it. Right? So what she's saying here is that artists take the time to see the beauty in things, right? Then they take that and then expand it to something else, and then you as the viewer get to experience the rest. But in order to do that, you need to be able to attach, and you have to be able to be realistic on what you're seeing and judge it. Just look at it. All right, so being an active participant. First, you have to take the time to see it, right? Number two, realize what you're looking at. Okay. Now, the fastest way to do it is ask yourself whether it's representational, abstract, non-representational, right? Why? Because if it's representational, right, then you're seeing a figure or objects or subjects, different things, right? Abstract then is nature, right, that is being abstracted. And last but not least, non-representational, right? The cool thing is that if it's non-representational to me, that's the easiest. Why? Well, because non-representational is just about art. It's about light, color, texture, all of those things, and how they are put together. And I like it because I don't have to really go beyond conceptually to what I see. It is what it is, period. There's nothing beyond that. There's some things conceptually, but nothing too thick, right? Now, when you have representational art, when you have abstract art, then you have to go a lot further now, right? If it is representation, then you have to say, what does it mean? Yeah, what is the artist trying to say, right? You have these figures, and you have these plants, and you have whatever it is that is on the canvas or in the artwork. You have to ask yourself, is there something more beyond what I see? Right? Or is it just a replica of nature and that's it? The reality in art is that that's not the case. There's always more in there than what you see, especially with representational art, as I just mentioned. So let's look at a few things. In order to understand, in order to break it down, okay, we have to understand that when you're looking at a piece of artwork, there's two parts. There's form and there's content. Form is the total effect of the combined visual qualities the work of art has. It includes the components such as materials, color, shape, line, design, all the things you can recognize on a piece of art, right? You can look at it and say all of those things. Best way to describe this is imagine that you are dating, right? And you go into, let's say, a bar or coffee shop, right? And you're looking around the room, right? And when you're looking around the room, you are looking at individuals based on what they look like: long hair, short hair, brown eyes, blue eyes, whatever it is, right? That is the form. You're just looking at the appearance and you're describing to yourself in the back of the head what you're seeing, or your eyes are describing it, right? That is form. Now, the next one, apologies. Next one right here is going to be content. Content is much further in, is the meaning, is the message the art has, that includes the emotional, intellectual, symbolic, thematic, narrative connotation. There's a whole bunch of things that are part of the artwork that are just beyond the facade of paint with all the figures and the things in it, right? So, and there, then you are finding what the artist expressing or trying to communicate to the viewer. That's where you're going to find the art, right? The idea, the concept. That's where you're going to find it, right? And it'll be, going back to the metaphor that I was talking about in the bar or coffee shop, that'll be like sitting down with somebody and then talking with them, finding out who they are, what they like to do, really who they are as a person, right? And then at that point, once you figure out all those things about the person, well, they can judge it whether you like the person or not, right? So art is always trying to communicate something, whether it's a message to the viewer or the world of art. That's something else to really understand, is that art is not just this thing for everybody to consume by themselves, but that it has no meaning. There's always a meaning behind art. And there's two things, like I mentioned. So there's the messages either to the viewer or to the world of art. And what do I mean by that? So there's two ways of communication by an artist, right? There's artist to viewer and artist to artist. The same thing exists with scientists and basically in every field out there. So this is not just for art, this is in general. So let's go back to these artist concepts. So how many times have we hear, especially with this COVID stuff, or especially with the time of pandemic, right? You have a lot of scientific concepts that are being described to the public in a very simplified manner in which the public can understand it, right? So there's a communication between scientists and the public in a specific way, in a specific set of language that the public can understand, right? And that's a communication between public and scientists. Now, are there, other communications happening between scientists and scientists? There are. There's journals and there's publications and things like that. The scientists create for scientists. They're very scientific in regards to the vocabulary, in regards to the concepts, in regards to what's being moved forward. And a lot of times there are things that are even beyond the public's understanding. That are even experimentational. They're not really completely fully developed ideas that eventually become developed ideas and things like that, right? And eventually those concepts become very important experiments or new things in the world, right? Between scientists and scientists. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is if you're going through a science museum, right, and you look at the artifacts in the science museum, what are the artifacts you're going to find? Well, the scientific, moments in time where somebody, discovered something, right? So you're going to find the book of the scientist when he was doing, I don't know, discovering a specific set of vaccine, or the scientists that found how to create the television, and you have the television set and stuff like that. That's what you're going to find in the Museum of Science. Now, if we take the same exact concept and we bring it to the art world, right? And you're going to understand that the art world also communicates the same way. There's some artworks and artists who communicate between artist and audience very clearly, right? So it's going to have matter, it's going to have certain elements and symbols and colors and things like that. There's going to completely directly be brought out so that the public or the consumer can understand it, and you as public can go, oh, okay, that's exactly what I see, and so forth, right? However, there's a lot of artwork out there that is not meant really directly to a public out there, right? It's much more a conversation this way with the art world. We're trying as artists to push the limits of what things are, of what beauty is, or concepts of beauty. Also, there's discussions about uh, what line is, what color is, what texture is, and how what materials can do. And a lot of those things are communications this way and not that way. However, when we are creating a lot of artwork that has communication, there's some really interesting things that happen. And guess what? You get to experience those kind of breakthroughs in the art world. Where at the museums. How many times have you gone into a museum and go, well, I don't get this? Well, simple, because the conversations that are happening visually, are in some ways a vocabulary that is not a simple vocabulary that is being done this way between the artist and audience, but rather a much more sophisticated type of conversation is going on here. Now, the cool thing is that you can always educate yourself in art or in sciences and understand the kind of communication, the kind of much more sophisticated communication that's going on between these two, right? Only by educating yourselves. But that doesn't mean that because you cannot understand the vocabulary of science or the vocabulary of art or the vocabulary of technology between people within the same area, that is bad technology, bad science, or bad art for the matter of fact. All right. Well, let's look at this. All right. So let's break it down. So this is how you would kind of approach a piece of artwork in a museum. So, okay, what are we looking at? So first of all, is it representational, abstract, non-representational? Right? So most likely it's going to be representational because we can recognize what it is. Simple enough. Now, because it is representational, now we go into the next question. What are we looking at? And then we start with the formal elements. What do we look at physically? What are we seeing in front of you? If you're seeing two people, that's incorrect. There's two figures, right? There's no people here. This is made out of stone. We have two figures. We have a female figure and we have a male figure. Right? Now, this object's made out of stone. Now we can presume what the stone is, right? You can say either marble or you can what it could be. Anyways, whatever kind of material you think it might be, but it's stone nevertheless, right? What other things? So you can say that you have some texture here that makes it look like rock, right? And then we have some texture that makes this look like skin. And basically we can describe those elements, right? It's smooth, it's rough, it looks like two figures, male, female, and that's about it, right? Oh, and also the color, white. Right. Now, the next thing we're going to do is now we're going to the concept part, right? Into the next level. We're going to get to know this artwork further. So how can we get to understand the art, right? Well, let's talk about it. What are these two figures doing? They're embracing, they are making out, kissing, right? And then we're going to add, the baggage, right, of the material or the things that we look at. So just like we did with the artwork in the previous PowerPoint, we're going to talk about the material. So what does the material tell us about this? Material is strong, right? It's made of wood, it's made out of stone, sorry. And it's pure, right? And it's going to last forever, and all these different things about the material. Can we say that love Or can we say that a kiss or this kind of embrace is something that is pure, lasts forever, and so forth and so on, right? So this is how you break down a piece of art, right? We start from the very beginning, recognizing what it is, and then moving. Okay. Now this one's easier because it is representational. It's something you can recognize, and that's Agustin Rodin. Now let's look at a different one. Let's look at a different one. What do we see here? Right now you're gonna start seeing. Well, hold on, Mr. Reed. This looks kind of the same, but not really the same, right? So what do we have here? Same thing. So representational, abstract, or non-representational. Say abstract, yeah, that's correct, because obviously it's not as representational as the previous one. But then what do we see? We see two figures. We see made of stone. They're white. Unfortunately, for this specific photograph, you cannot see the same material, but it's basically the same material, right? I always have a male and a female figure and so forth and so on. What are they doing? Same thing. They're making out, they're kissing, and so forth and so on, right? And this is Konstantin Brancusi, The Kiss. So both of these objects, you know, are describing basically the same. Both of these objects are describing a moment that is strong, that is pure, and so forth and so on. Now, some of you say, "Oh, but this one right here is more, it's more beautiful, or it's better art than this art, or than this one right here," and because it doesn't describe reality or nature the way it should be, right? And here's a great example of what I was talking about between an artwork that is basically having a conversation between artist and audience, and then here's an artwork that is having a conversation between artist and artist. Right? Because when Brancusi was creating the Kiss, he was trying to convey an idea of modern art that describes basically the unnecessary need for artwork. For artwork, artwork does not need literal descriptions of nature in order to represent certain things, right? So Brancusi basically was telling the artwork world, just like many other artists in the modern period, that you can edit out, you can subtract, abstract, bring down to its most basic of elements, you know, a concept, an idea, right? And still bring forth an idea to the world through the mediums of art, right? Without the need of this total replica of nature. So that's why, you know, Brancusi's work, just as much, obviously, as Renoir's work, right, eventually made it to a museum, right? And this lady right here is my mom. I take my mom everywhere, museums, galleries, openings. But anyways, so this is how, you know, certain objects that doesn't seem to be quote unquote art end up in museums. Because the concept is so important. Concept of the idea that an artistic object, which is made out of stone, right? The reality is the stone, and the reality is the line, texture, color on all those things, can describe the same concept about a kiss as the same stone that has been replicated. Now, in order to understand content, right, and symbols, it is not symbols, but the meaning behind things. And we need to understand that every single, not every single thing, but a lot of things in artworks are meant to be a form of communication, right? And there's three main ways of communicating things, and that's basically through symbols and the education or the study of signs and symbols is called semiotics. And this is very, very important because that's how you're able to kind of break down an artwork into a certain way so you can understand it better. Okay? So the study of signs and symbols and the series of interpretations is what we call semiotics. So semiotics is broken into three parts. The first one is what we call an icon. The second one is what we call an index. And the last one is what we call an actual symbol. Now, the sad thing is that in our world right now, we combine all those three things. We call icon symbols and symbols icons and index. We call symbols. It's a mess out there. But you have to understand that all these three things are completely different. Okay, an icon is a pictorial representation of something physically similar in real nature, right? So, for example, if I show you this image right here, what is it? It's an icon of a pencil, now, right? It is not a pencil. Why? Because this is a pencil, right? That right there, this right here is an icon. It's a pictorial representation of something that's physical, right? Just like if I had a tree or something in it. Icons tend to be much more universal, right? Because I could take this to, let's say, China or France and show that picture, and everybody's going to recognize pencil, right? We can even make it even much more simple, and we can do possibly like a tree outline, and we can go to any culture basically around the world, and most cultures are going to say, "Oh, tree," right? So that's an icon, a little representation. Index is slightly different. Index is a direct connection and or correlation. It can be inferred or observed. Now that's a big description to say something like, let me describe it this way. I'm going to finish this sentence. Where there is smoke, there is fire, right? That's basically what an index is. An index is this idea of a concept, a feeling, a relational thing that you have with what you're looking at that gives you an outcome. So once again, so you see smoke in the distance, even though you don't see the fire, you know there's a fire, right? Let's talk about your thermostat at home. If it has a red light blinking, right, the thermostat is running what? The heater or the cooler? Heater, right? And if it's running the blue light, or if it's blue, then you know it's, you know, the AC, right? Those are index. Right? Now that is not a symbol, that's an index. Very, very different. Last one, symbol. And a symbol is completely man-made. So it's a habit or norm learned, or conventionally, it's conventional and it's arbitrary. It's completely man-made. So for example, a flag is a man-made object. That's completely arbitrary, right? So is the symbol right here, right? What is the symbol right here, right? It's the play button, right? The play button is completely arbitrary. If I take this to some kind of native culture that doesn't have any electronics, they have no clue what that symbol means, right? So that's a symbol. A symbol is completely arbitrary. Now, it's very, very, very important to understand that symbols change meaning. Symbols are not monolithic in time, and they change from one time to another, depending on what that meaning is attached to that symbol, right? So if you look at a swastika, for example, a swastika as a symbol has meant different things throughout time, right? Or for example, one that's a little more controversial nowadays, you have the rebel flag, right? It had a meaning at one point, and then throughout time, it has changed its meaning, its concept. The symbol changes meaning throughout time, depending on what that habit or norm is connected to it, right? So please be mindful of symbols, because symbols do change. All right. One of the things about icons is that icons also change meanings depending on the cultural context of what it's being done. So iconography helps us with an understanding of this icons within the context of the image, right? remember that an icon comes from nature, so we can recognize it from reality and see it on a painting, right? A symbol is different. A symbol is created, right? Okay. So iconography is a symbolic meaning of subjects and signs used to convey ideas important to a particular culture, religion, groups, etc. So, for example, religious paintings have a whole bunch of iconographies, a whole bunch of icons. So, for example, we have this dove right here, right? So that dove, if you're a Christian, especially if you're a Latin Christian, you should know this right off the bat, right? So this is the spirit, and it's a dove, right? So it is an icon. It's an icon because a dove recognizes from the world, and it represents purity. It represents the Holy Spirit. And we also have fire, and a few of the different things here throughout the painting that are icons. Now, different from a symbol, right? So this is man-made, right? This is a symbol, like the cross is a symbol. This right here is a symbol, right? Actually, no, that's not a symbol because that's an icon. My apologies. But this is definitely a symbol. The next one, oh, sorry, I meant to bring this one as well. Western religions are not the only ones that have symbology. All religions around the world. Here we have water, the lily pad, the way he's seeing the third eye, etc. And if we bring that to contemporary times, icons, and I think I said symbols a second ago, but that meant to say icons, my apology. Like with icons in this case, we have, ironically, a very iconic artist, which is Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol, most people think of Andy Warhol as this pretty little, objects and the repetition of the objects. But if you still really start looking at what he did artistically and his ideas of art, there was some really interesting concepts here about iconography. So icons, especially when talking about a person, is a kind of diluted version of something to mean something else. So in this case, for example, if we talk about Marilyn Monroe as an icon, what is she? What does it represent? So you talk about sexuality, you talk about youth, you talk about stardom, you can talk about beauty, you can talk about, all these other elements that Marilyn Monroe as an icon represents. And one of the things that Warhol did with repetition of this imagery through printmaking, it kind of echoes the reality of what happens to the individual when it's iconified, right? So as Warhol repeats this imagery over and over and over again, the mesh, the material changes, and you never really have a true representation of what the original is, right? So, for example, in this case, the ink is slowly being, eroded or clogged, so you can actually print. In this case, some of them are stronger than others and lighter and whatever else. But it's not a true representation of the person. Just like when you talk about Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe as an icon is not Marilyn Monroe, right? Do we know who she was? What she liked, what she didn't like, really as a person? What were her feelings of us as an individual? None of those things matter. So the ideas behind Warhol is that this icon kind of replaces the original. And the more you utilize the icon or this main original icon, then erodes more and more and more and more and more the original, which is really, really cool. Last but not least, we have this right here, right? And the last one is going to be, no, next one, sorry, is index. So index, which is direct connection correlation, right? So we're talking about fire and smoke. So this is a beautiful piece of artwork that I think conveys what index is in an artwork. Um, can you see what this artwork's made out of? If you saw razor blades, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. Now, most of you, when I said there were razor blades, and when you realized that those are razor blades, you felt threatened by this artwork, right? You can feel the sense of pain that laying on this bed could do to you. That feeling, that emotion, that kind of information that goes past your mind and kind of into your feelings, that is an index. And artworks that are very well done are able to use index to convey idea and emotions in that matter, right? So in this case, for example, Lippy, she wanted to make you understand how she felt as a female within the context of her marriage inside her culture, right? She wanted you to feel how trapped and how she felt in a marital bed, right? Now, the cool thing about when artwork is well done through index or using index concepts to convey an idea is that no matter who you are, you can empathize or connect with the artwork. So whether you're male or female, you can feel the pain and possibly empathize with her concepts of the artwork. Right? Now, the bed's not the only thing she made. She also made, bras and high heel shoes and a few that, and all made out of razor. So that is the beauty. That is really some of the cool things about having index in artwork. And last but not least, symbols. And symbols, as I mentioned before, they are completely arbitrary. They're man-made. They are like flags. Right? Now, the best way to understand flags or understand symbols and how important it is to understand that symbols aren't man-made and that they change meaning is, for example, here we have flags of the United States, right? Everybody recognizes it, especially all of you recognize it. But now the next thing, let me ask you something. Can you recognize what the Texas flag look like? Some of you, most of you can probably get it out this way, but if I told you to draw it, some of you might actually draw it differently. Maybe some of you will draw it just with a star on one corner. But nevertheless, you get the idea of what it looks like. But let's say, what does the flag of Louisiana look like? What does the flag of Maryland look like? Well, let's go even further out. Trinidad and Tobago. Right? They are flags, but you don't know what they mean. And that's because they're symbols. Right? So symbols aren't man-made. They're not the same as icons, and they're not the same thing as images. Those three different things are three different groups altogether. So when you are approaching artwork and you're looking at trying to figure out what the artist is trying to do or trying to say, you have to allow yourself to say, okay, this is a icon for yada yada yada, and kind of break those things down. Or, oh my God, this is an index. It makes me feel this way. I approached it in this manner to where I have this relationship. Or there's a symbol, right? And what is the symbol representing culturally? How is this related to the time period, to myself, and so forth and so on, right? So three different approaches depending on what the artist is trying to come. And guys, this is the last one. So this is the last screen for that PowerPoint. I hope you liked it, and I will see you guys for the next one.